This is the second episode in a two-part series, and the second case in our season covering cases in Georgia, Illinois, and Montana. This series discusses historic homophobia, violence, exhumation, crime scenes, murder, and the crimes of John Wayne Gacy. This is The Fall Line. Last time, we began the story of Roger Aguirre, who was last seen on November 20th, 1975. Roger was just 22 years old. He'd recently reconnected with the maternal side of his family, and this was due to the efforts of his older half-sister Carol, who'd been searching for Roger for years. As an infant, he'd gone to live with paternal relatives in Texas. Though Carol and her siblings, back in Alabama, knew that they had a baby brother, they never got to see him. It was 18 years before Carol tracked Roger down. By then, she was living in Chicago with her own children. She'd had 12 daughters, and many were young enough to still be in the home. Around 1972 or 1973, Roger moved to Illinois to be with them. He'd spent a while living with Carol and her family, which was a happy time for them all. When he moved out on his own, Roger still visited them often. In November of 1975, Roger was working at a company called Commercial Solvents in an administrative role and living on the 3000 block of West Wellington. Roger spent a lot of time with a friend named Ernest or Ernesto, who might have also gone by Ernestine. They'd hang out at bars and clubs, mostly in what author David Nelson described to us as the Newtown area of Chicago. Ernest and Roger, they weren't dating. Roger was going through a bad breakup with his boyfriend, a man that Carol didn't know well, around the time of his disappearance. Roger's family never saw Ernest after Roger went missing. There's concern that something could have happened to Ernest, too. Roger came to Carol's home on November 18th, 1975, to discuss that bad breakup. Carol's daughter Valerie recently spoke with her cousin Becky about it. As you'll recall from last episode, Becky is a cousin and another relative whom Carol discovered as an adult. She's now one of the driving forces behind the search for Roger. Here's the memory that Valerie shared with Becky. I remember so clearly the last time I saw Uncle Roger. It was November 18th, 1975, my 8th birthday. Kitchen of our house on Altgeld Street, leaning against the doorframe while talking to my mom, who was sitting at the kitchen table. I remember thinking that Mom was so happy to finally get to know her little brother. It was only a few days later that Roger disappeared, and we never heard from him again. My Uncle Roger's disappearance has been especially difficult for my mother, who, her whole life, could not wait to meet her brother and search for him until she finally found him. She invited him to come and live with us in Chicago. We were all excited to finally meet him, but we only had him for such a short time. Roger was upset on the day that Valerie saw him. He'd come to talk to Carol about the breakup, and if he'd disappeared then, she might have believed that he'd done it on purpose. But he was seen again on November 20th. His own maternal grandmother lived in the same building, on West Wellington. That afternoon, she saw Roger outside. He was speaking to a middle-aged man who was sitting inside a red car. That was the last sighting of Roger. Days later, when he hadn't contacted his family, they went to his apartment to check on him. All the lights were on, and the TV was too. It was as if he'd stepped out for a moment, and he'd simply never returned. Anything might have happened to Roger Aguirre, and his family understands that. But there is reason to suspect that he might have crossed paths with John Wayne Gacy. We presented some of that evidence last episode, via interviews with Becky and the author David Nelson. Roger moved in the same spaces as Gacy, both in terms of where he lived and where he socialized, and his job may have created opportunities for them to meet as well. Moreover, Roger matches the rough profile of some of Gacy's unidentified victims. It is not that Roger's family wants to fit him into the profile of a famous serial killer, but they researched and they spoke to people, and they got the advice to contact authorities about ruling Roger in or ruling him out. And that's where we left off last time, when Becky had begun to work in earnest on Roger's missing persons case. She had several goals. To dig up old reports and get Roger's information into new systems, that was one. She also wanted to speak with law enforcement about the Gacy theory. That was another. Then the family could move on and investigate Roger's case. With DNA in the system, he could be compared to unidentified persons across the United States. They were starting from nothing, but Becky was willing to do that. Her first step was to reach out to Cook County Sheriff's Office.
So Carol has been searching for her half-brother for almost 50 years. So when she told this story, I didn't know that much about Gacy. I mean, I knew the regular common knowledge, but I saw on Cook County Sheriff's website, they had a form you could fill out if you had a male family member who was missing between 1970 and 1979. So Roger went missing in 1975, November 20th of 1975. At first I asked Carol if she wanted me to do it. She said yes. I filled it out. She cannot hear well on the phone, so I said, is it okay if I leave my phone number? And she said yes. And so at that point, Jason Moran, who was a lieutenant detective with Cook County Sheriff's Office, contacted me. We talked on the phone. I told him the circumstances. And then I said, if you'll give me your email, I'll send a follow-up email with everything we've talked about. And then from that point on, he communicated with me about anything I could tell him. Did I have a picture? What did Roger do? And all this kind of stuff. I believe it was the end of November or the first week in December when Commander Moran, he met Carol and her daughter at a Starbucks to do the DNA test. When he came to the Starbucks, he had a copy of the missing person report that was filed by Carol, and he showed it to her. And so her daughter saw it as well. Our whole thing was, well, can Carol have a copy of that? So I tried every year, I would send a FOIA for that missing persons report, and I would get different things. All those records have been destroyed. We cannot locate anything. It's part of an active investigation, and then you need to give us the case number and the officer who took it. NamUs said a lot of times if there was not a missing persons report and Commander Moran took a call from a family member who had someone who was missing, he would fill out a missing persons report if he could not find one in his files. I was able to contact with Roger's half-sister in Texas. Her name is Heather. We've never met. We've texted each other, we've emailed each other, and we've talked on the phone. And I wanted to find out what kind of person Roger was, growing up in San Antonio. She was born the same year that Roger disappeared. So she has never known Roger. And so now she has connected us with the half-brother who gave a DNA test, and we were hopeful this might close some gaps. And Detective Moran said it did not further the case, but that was it. It started out very hopeful, and I felt like, well, we're really gaining traction here, and maybe we will get some answers. It's kind of like a roller coaster. You're up here because you have hope, and then, that doesn't play out. And at the beginning, I would tell Carol what was going on. But then I thought, I'm not going to take her along for the ride. It's just too upsetting, because it really plays on you mentally and emotionally when you think you're getting somewhere and then you're not. And there are times that you just have to step back a little bit and just take a break. And it's during those times, usually you think of, well, what have I not done?
Heather was not the only person whom Becky got in touch with. She reached out to the NamUs Regional Coordinator, too, in order to discuss having Roger listed as a missing person on their website. Keep in mind that a civilian can only make an entry request, so when Becky says that she uploaded Roger's case, she means that she asked that he be listed on NamUs.
I had immediately loaded Roger's case into NamUs, and that was great. And then they don't release it to the public. It's hidden, and it's been hidden since 2019.
When Becky says that Roger's case is hidden, she means that he's been assigned a NamUs number, but that his page is not visible to the general public. Our understanding is that he was not in NamUs prior to 2019, so this is a totally new entry. We were given his NamUs number, and we verified that we cannot access his page. But Becky has been assured by a number of officials that the page is visible on their side. We have seen pages hidden before, but normally that's when the cases they feature are close to a solve. This is the first time that we've encountered a missing persons entry being hidden from the very start. Becky says that she was confused by this and then tried to get more information.
And I get in this hamster wheel of I contact the person for the region for NamUs and say, hey, can you tell me why this is hidden? Well, it's hidden because the detective does not want us to release it. You'll have to talk to him. So then we email him or call him, and we don't get a response. And so a few months later, I go again to the NamUs person, and it's just this constant. I was hopeful with NamUs. I was, and the regional specialists have been great. I mean, one of them told me, the last one I talked to said, I said, can you, maybe not in this situation, but in any situation, why would a case be hidden from the public? And he started to give me an example, and he said, no, that's not really a good example. And then he started to give me another example, and he said, no, that's not really a good one either. And then he said, we had a case, and we were 90% sure we knew who the person was, but we had just not crossed the finish line. And we didn't want to release it to the public. He said that they would start getting attention and tips, and it may not have anything to do with the case he had. I spoke with NamUs, and I told her about this, and she immediately opened her laptop and pulled up Roger's case, and I said, no, you don't have to look at his specific case. And she said, no, I'm invested now that I've heard the story. And so I asked her, because I had heard the podcast, The Clown and the Candyman. And the last episode is Detective Moran talking about a lead on body number 28. And it is Carol and Roger's story, almost verbatim. And I said, would you not release that to the public if it was a high-profile case? And she said, yes, that could be a reason.
To be clear, we have no confirmation that it was Roger's case that was being discussed on the podcast episode that Becky mentioned. We do have a transcript of the audio that she's referencing. It's a short excerpt from episode 8, The Dust Never Settles, which was released in 2021. The context is a discussion of victim 28, whose remains were discovered in the area of the barbecue pit. The episode host asked someone identified as Commander Moran, quote, if he had any clues about this young man. And the commander replied with the following, quote, a family member recently called. She had a missing half-brother. Their in-common mother was a bit of a rolling stone and had multiple husbands and boyfriends, and they lived separately as a result of that for most of their youth. Later on, this woman who reached out to me said that she wanted to know her brother, so she reached out to him. He decided to move here to Chicago, and they had a wonderful time. This was also a quote from the commander. Quote, the circumstances surrounding his disappearance last seen getting in a car with an unknown older male white, fits perfectly with what we know about how Gacy acquired his victims. And sure enough, in the Gacy room, there was a file, a missing persons file, on this individual from the late 70s. So I collected a DNA sample, submitted it to the lab, and the lab will look at them, and they'll start seeing if there's genetic associations between relatives of this missing boy and victim number 28. Becky says that hearing this audio is what caused her to make the connection that Roger was being compared, specifically, against victim 28. In response, we reached out for comment regarding Roger's case, but we have not received a reply as of the recording of this episode. However, Cook County Sheriff's Office itself released a statement to NBC5 Chicago, actually just days before we were set to record. NBC5 responded to a press release sent out by our colleague Haley Gray and Light the Way Advocacy. They contacted local media on the 49th anniversary of Roger's disappearance in hopes of attracting attention for his case. When asked for comment on the inclusion or exclusion of Roger and DNA testing in general, Cook County issued this statement to the news channel. Quote, "Initial tests of Ms. Erickson's DNA were inconclusive and required testing of a closely related maternal relative of Mr. Aguirre. Unfortunately, the process has been delayed due to operational and funding issues experienced by the lab that the Sheriff's Office uses to conduct the complex and intensive DNA testing required in these types of cases. The investigation into the identities of the remaining unidentified Gacy victims is ongoing, and the Sheriff's Office will work with Ms. Erickson to obtain a sample from another relative when lab testing is secured." Roger's family is happy to hear this. They still have questions, though. Could they help more by bringing in relatives? Can some of the nonprofits who offer grants or free services aid with new testing for FIGG? Does Roger's case still need to be hidden on NamUs? They are very supportive of Cook County's efforts. They just need to know what's next. Becky told us that a NamUs contact she spoke with told her that Roger's case is being actively worked. At the time of this recording, his page is still not public, but hopefully that status could change very soon. Meanwhile, Becky has reached out to experts to try and learn more about how they can help to identify him and to get more DNA into the system. One expert she spoke with is Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. Dr. Fitzpatrick, who was a founder of DNA Doe Project and went on to establish Identifinders International, is a pioneer of forensic investigative genetic genealogy. Dr. Fitzpatrick told Becky that because the available testers are half-siblings and Roger's parents are deceased, the process can be a little trickier.
Her questions to me were, where did Carol submit her DNA? Law enforcement matches against the CODIS database for unidentified remains or to GEDmatch for genealogical analysis. If in CODIS, a half-brother or half-sister probably won't go a long way to finding a match. CODIS is only good for parents and children of the unidentified human remains. Having a half-sister or a half-brother who shares the same mother allows for mitochondrial DNA comparison. A match shows that the unidentified person shares a direct female line with a half-sister or brother. That is used for analyzing highly degraded remains. It's not a 100% ID, as it depends on population statistics and circumstantial factors. Having a half-brother who shares the same father allows for Y-STR comparison. Again, it's not 100%, but it does show that the unidentified person shares a direct male line with the half-brother or sister. Having a half-brother or half-sister is good enough for genealogy.
What Dr. Fitzpatrick said, basically, is this. A close male relative, a full brother or father, could be helpful in the testing for Roger if they're doing the kind of DNA comparisons used, as she said, in CODIS. But his father is deceased, too. Though Heather has found a few items that belong to their father, Dr. Fitzpatrick advised that they were likely too contaminated from long storage. Heather is going to keep looking, though. Like Carol, she feels robbed of the relationship that she might have had with Roger. She never got to meet him at all, and she's only known him through his disappearance.
I do want to say about Heather, she has given me permission. I just want to read you a text from her so you get a feeling of what she's going through. She never met Roger. She was born the same year that Roger disappeared. And she says to me, "Thank you again for doing all of this. Roger has grown more in my heart since I have met you than he ever has before." And I think that same sentiment is growing in my family members. I'm just so sad that I did not have some of these conversations with my dad. Honestly, the story of Roger was more like folklore in my house because no one ever talked about it. I care about Roger and what happened to him. He is my brother as much as my other brothers are. I have just never met him. You know, my whole life, when someone asked me how many kids my dad has or how many siblings I have always said 12. I have met all of them but one. He is missing. So horrible and sad. And I think it's really gotten to her too. And we contacted every high school in San Antonio to see if Roger went there with no luck. I put an ad in the San Antonio Express, just leaving an email. Can you tell us, did you go to school with Roger? Can you tell us anything about him growing up? No response.
Becky is relieved that the family has gotten some news this fall, but, she says, time is of the essence, and they need clarity sooner rather than later.
I think that's all we want. And, Carol's been emailing, her daughter's been emailing. I've been emailing on Carol's behalf, asking, please contact Carol. She's legally deaf, so don't call her, but here's her email and here's the questions she has. And it's been crickets. And, it's just real frustrating. You're at a brick wall. And I said, even if they just said, we continue to work on the case and have nothing new to report and send that back, anything would make you think they cared. And I'm not saying that they don't. I know Roger's not the only missing person in Chicago. And they've got a ton of missing people. And this is 50 years old and it's not easy and all that. And I think part of the hesitation in my mind would be, okay, they didn't accept Mrs. Marino's results. And they're saying, no, it's him, it's him, it's him. Are they afraid that if they identify somebody, if they admit that, it's opening the floodgates? I just don't know. I don't know. So my husband was in a conference in Chicago, and I said, well, if you drive, we can go by and see Carol and spend a day with her, and then you can go to your conference, and I can entertain myself while you're at your conference. And so we did. We stopped and had a good visit with Carol, and we actually did a Zoom while we were there with Bill Dorsch, who's a retired homicide detective who knew Gacy and felt like there were other bodies in Chicago that they had never looked into, these places where other bodies could have been buried. So we had a good visit. And then my husband went to his conference, and I said, well, I'm going to take the car and I'm going to go down to Cook County Sheriff's And so I did. And the guy at the window would not engage with me, told me to sit down. And then he said, "Who are you here to see?" And I said, "Commander Moran." So I see him call back. And in a few minutes, this woman walks up who has a uniform on. And she said, "Commander Moran has multiple offices all over the city, and he is not here today. Can I help you?" And so I had a business card and I handed it to her and I said, "I'm here to talk to him about a missing persons case that he's handling." And she sees that I'm from Alabama and she said, "Well, did you come all the way for this? Why didn't you set up an appointment?" And I said, "No." And I explained. In my mind, I was saying, how can I set up an appointment if nobody responds to me? But I didn't. And she was very nice. And I had Roger's name written on the back of it. And I think Carol's email address. And I said, "Can you just please give this to him and ask him to please contact Carol?" And she said, "I promise I will." Nothing. And I can't think of anything else to do. Send a certified letter. I mean, I just don't know. And my daughter has been a victim's advocate for years. She now works for the state of Tennessee. She formed a task force that looks into crimes against women, particularly, and reviews that. And she said, "Mom, they've got more than one case." And I said, "Yes, I know." And she said, "Give him time to respond." And so after, initially putting that form in, he did contact me about 4 days later. And then I looked back when I was doing the timeline and I'm going, this is not like I was emailing and calling every day. There were months that I did not contact him. And so, I think families walk that tightrope between how much do I push? And if I push too much, this is my only source of information. I sure don't want to hack them off. But if you're not responding, what am I supposed to do? And you feel like if you don't get the answer, sometimes you think, is this my fault? Did I do something wrong? Should I have done this or that? Or if this happened, and you blame yourself a lot. And I know time is of the essence here. And I would just hope that Carol could get some resolution. That's all I want. If it's not him, it's not him. But if it's close and you need more, then let us know and we'll get it for you. And I do want to say, Light the Way was very important in this because they, things were stuck and nothing was moving. And then I had been listening to the Fall Line for several years. And then I think it was season 17, I heard Shana Richard and Tate Nunez with Light the Way on a program. And I thought, well, maybe I can reach out to them. Maybe they know something else I can try. I had just filed another FOIA request for Roger's missing persons report from 1975. Carol had filed one. And the response to me from Cook County was, "I need the case number. You need to provide us the case number and the officer who took the report, his name." And I'm like, well, how am I going to know that from 1975? And that's when they got interested in the case. They set up a Zoom with me. They created the first missing persons flyer that Roger ever had. We posted it on Facebook. One of Carol's daughters posted it and it got 186 shares. Then that led to David Nelson, who was the author of Boys Enter the House, about the victims of Gacy and their lives before they met Gacy. And a lot of them paralleled somewhat Roger's life. And so he contacted us. And then he's got all this information and he's telling us all these things. And then, like the way connects us with Haley Gray. And she does a press release. And the press release goes out in Chicago. And then Fox 32 wants to do an interview with Carol. And I mean, none of this would have happened without them. And without the fall line, because I never would have heard probably of them.
We are glad that Becky heard of Light the Way on this podcast, and that it helped set off a chain of events that connected her with some good people. Now, she needs help to keep building that momentum. We understand that with any major case, there are details that can simply not be shared. The flow of information can change, depending on what law enforcement is seeking from the public, too. And that's something that we discussed with author David Nelson. You heard from him last episode. He helped us understand more about Chicago, John Wayne Gacy, and Gacy's victims. David has been working with Roger's family since this past summer, so he has some insight from both sides.
The Cook County Sheriff's Department has always honored my FOIA requests, but they have never really honored my requests for interviews. And I did speak with some of the detectives back in the day, but that kind of went radio silent. And that's sort of par for the course with a lot of families, a lot of other researchers. They stop talking to you after a while. And of course, there's other crimes far more current going on that grab their attention. There's other cold cases that they're dealing with, but we are sometimes up against a wall in communication with the police, especially the Cook County Sheriff's Department. Roger's family has hit a wall as well with communication. The last they've heard is that the report was inconclusive. I don't think that's good enough, and I don't believe that. I feel like there's enough DNA on both sides, the unidentified victims and Roger's family, to conclusively say yes or no if Roger was a victim of John Wayne Gacy or not. But we just can't get an answer.
One thing that David's been able to help us understand is the lack of success we've had in obtaining Roger's original missing persons reports from Chicago PD. David thinks that he can explain why we can't get those reports, and also shed some light on how the investigation might have gone back in 1975.
So, according to Roger's family, there was actually 2 missing persons reports filed for Roger. One was immediately after he went missing in late 1975. Now, the husband of one of his other half-sisters apparently saw who he thought was Roger on the street, and that missing persons report was then canceled. A couple of months later, in early 1976, that brother-in-law sees that individual he thinks is Roger once again, goes up to confront him, and then realizes that it's not actually Roger, that he was mistaken. So there's then a second missing persons report filed. Now, because Roger was 23 at that time, the police are only going to look so hard for a missing 23-year-old. I also think they probably heard or knew that Roger was gay and maybe didn't look as hard enough either. They thought he was maybe trying to run away from his family. I would assume that the police would make a lot of assumptions on why Roger had run away. I'm sure they thought he was running away when he was definitely missing. He wouldn't have gone out of contact with his family. He was close with members of his family and some friends as well. It's highly unlikely that he would have just stepped away one day and never been in touch all these years. Now, some young men who went missing at the time turned up in recent years. They had run away from their families, and Cook County Sheriff's Department located them living off somewhere. One family was so certain that Gacy had killed their loved one that they actually went to the prison where Gacy was executed for the kind of media circus that was involved around his execution in 1994. But that young man was then found alive in 2011 or 2012, sometime around there. He was found alive and well. Some of these people just go out of contact. But I don't think Roger would have done that based on his family life and the connections he had in his life. He just wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't have stepped away from a job, wouldn't have stepped away from friends. I definitely think the first missing persons report does not exist. I think that was canceled and probably thrown out. The second one was probably left open, but because Roger was over 18, he was probably assumed to be missing of his own accord. That report was probably just left in the records and just kind of left to gather dust. At some point between then and now, there was a purging of old files, old police files from the Chicago police, not just for Roger, but for other missing boys who were never conclusively linked to the Gacy case. I've never been able to find their missing persons reports. Those don't exist anymore. So I think those boys either were over 18 or were missing up until the point where they would have turned 18. And those reports were just tossed out. I don't think there's a report for Roger out there that's waiting to be found. I would certainly love for some old detective to come forward and say he has it in his garage, or they find it in the archives warehouse or something like that. But I just don't think it exists out there, which is really a shame because there's so much information that could help us with. If it's not Gacy, then there's maybe there's a kernel of a clue to what actually did happen if it wasn't Gacy. So unfortunately, I think it's just lost to time at this point.
We have spent a fair amount of time in these episodes focused on whether Roger might fit the profile of one of Gacy's remaining unidentified victims. But David Nelson also made us aware that there may be other unaccounted-for victims that were not located at Gacy's residential property. These victims could be John Does who have not yet been linked to Gacy, or decedents whose remains have never been discovered. Until I spoke to you, I was completely unaware that there are potential victims of Gacy that might not be found on his property. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So this property was located on West Miami Avenue, and Gacy was the caretaker there for a little while. In a police officer at the time in the mid-70s who knew Gacy lived nearby. So one evening, this police officer was coming home in the middle of the night and noticed that Gacy was outside digging. And that later on, when Gacy was arrested for all these murders, that raised alarm bells for him. Nothing was done on that property at the time. That was not investigated. I have not really found any reports of them looking at that property or even knowing about it until later on. Now, there have been two separate investigations into that property. There are people who believe there are still remains there that the police did not do a good job investigating, that there are discrepancies in their report that indicate there could be remains there. Based on everything I know about the case, about Gacy, I think it's definitely possible that someone is buried there. I don't think it's going to be a huge mass grave of 30 plus victims. I just don't think that's likely. Could there be a body or two found there? Maybe three? Yes, I think it's possible. We'll never know until that ground is fully dug up. So there's a potential for that. A lot of people think that in Gacy's travels, when he was renovating pharmacies all over the Midwest back in the 70s, that he might have had a victim there somewhere and discarded of them while he was traveling. I don't think that's as likely. I think people really want to kind of find all these other unidentified victims and tie him to all these other different cases and crimes. But I think when Gacy was traveling, he was all business. He was out of the comfort of his home where he could discard of the bodies on his own terms. He could be their keeper, for lack of a better term. He could oversee their remains. He could run this graveyard. And Gacy also did not indicate that there were any bodies anywhere else. And I do take him at his word, at least for a certain point of time. Once he realized he was staring at the death penalty, potentially, he sort of backtracked on his story, started blaming other people. And I do think other people have some knowledge of the crimes or participated in the crimes, but he backtracks on his story. And then there's an era of time where he's just not truthful and he's just talking himself up and lying through his teeth. So aside from the crawl space and the property, there were also bodies found in the river. There were 4 victims who were pulled out of the Splains River. Gacy claimed he dropped 5 bodies off of the bridge on I-55 into the river. He claims one of the bodies may have landed on a passing barge. No other 5th river victim has been identified, but it's always possible. He was pretty adamant that 5 victims went into the river, so there's that possibility. Gacy also told his lawyers in spring of 1979 on tape that he killed a man with ties to the military. He estimated this individual was around 24 years old, and it was in the winter, and he took that body to the forest preserve where he discarded of the body. I've heard rumors about that body being found, but not linked. I have a few individuals who were found there that could have potentially been a victim, but he didn't conclusively get linked or even mentioned in connection with Gacy because so many of the victims were being found at the property or the river. No one really thought that there could be potentially a body buried or found in the woods as well. But Gacy talked about that. Some of the investigators talked about it. There's that potential of him definitely dropping remains in one of the forest preserves or nearby wooded areas.
As David told us, there are a lot of missing boys and men in Chicago whose cases may have not been investigated. A few of them might be tied to these leads Gacy gave investigators, or that were reported and simply not followed up on. Whether or not Roger could be one of those men is not something that we can even guess at. But with answers to the DNA question, his family hopes that they will either have some resolution or that they can see his profile go public on NamUs and start rallying attention for him. There are so many pieces to this puzzle that the family is still missing. They need to track down more of Roger's friends, people he hung out with, like Ernest, who might know more about what was going on between November 18th and November 20th. Someone who has hints to the identity of the man in that red car. Anyone with information as to who might have wished Roger harm. When we spoke with David Nelson, he was in the process of working with 2 filmmakers on a long-form blog about Roger in hopes of getting more attention on his case. So we asked David what else he thought might be done to help further leads.
To answer your question about other leads, I think right now what everyone's doing is probably the most help, and that's talking to other researchers like yourself, other podcasters. Roger's name is now in the media. He was on the local Fox network here, Fox 5, I think it is. I think that can only help. Even if Roger is not a Gacy case, unfortunately, right now, tying his name to this major case will probably get his story out there a little bit more. Like, people still Google this case, people still read about it. It's still in the news. People are publishing books each year about it. Tying his case to a bigger case can only get more eyes on it. And I think based on that, I feel like someone could come forward, not necessarily Ernestine or Ernest, but another friend that someone has forgotten about or someone didn't know about that might have some small piece of the puzzle, whether it's from Chicago or back in San Antonio. Someone could come forward with some additional information. Time is running out because it's been almost about 50 years. People are getting older, memories are declining, but I always believe, because I did this so many times with the victims and their families that I interviewed, there was always people that came out of the woodwork. Even in Chicago, you talk to people randomly. If I mention my book or mention the case, they'll come up with some story that they have in connection with the case. Oh, I ran into John Wayne Gacy here. Or I knew one of his victims. So there are still people out there that have these tertiary ties to the case, or they have direct ties to the case. We just have to kind of get the word out of Roger's case, and not just Roger's case, but the case of other missing boys from that time period. I have lists of these young men that are still missing as of today, or haven't been located.
Becky is willing to do that, whatever it takes to get the word out about Roger. She wants to work with Cook County and any other agencies that can assist in collaboration for their common goal. Roger's sister Carol recently turned 80 years old, and Becky is determined to find answers for her cousin. It's not fair, she says, that Roger and Carol only had a few years together. There should have been more time. As Becky wrote to us in an email, quote, I asked Carol what is her memory of Roger that brings her joy. And Carol told me he could be his real self with me. We could tell each other anything. Carol cannot wait any longer. The time is now. We need you to help Roger Aguirre get the media attention that he never received. There has got to be someone out there in Chicago who knew him. Roger Aguirre was 22 years old at the time of his disappearance. He is described as a Hispanic male with black hair and brown eyes, and was between 5'9" and 5'11". Roger was last seen outside his apartment on the 3000 block of West Wellington. If you have information regarding the disappearance of Roger Aguirre, or information that might help identify the remaining unidentified victims of John Wayne Gacy, please contact Cook County Sheriff's Office at 708-865-6244. If you're a friend of Roger's who would prefer to connect directly with his family, contact us at falllinepodcast@gmail.com, and we will get you connected. Next time on The Fall Line, our final episode of the season takes us to Great Falls, Montana, where Jamie Takesgun was murdered in October of 2022. And for the past 2 years, there's been no movement in his case. Be sure to join us then. If you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to check your subscriptions to make sure you're set for automatic downloads so that you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, which covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case and the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified person cases, is out everywhere now as a hardcover, ebook, or audiobook read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books or through your local library. Find out more in the link in our show notes. If you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our family therapy fund and actively paying for therapy for families who have appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. If you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, we also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton, with additional research assistance this season by Melissa Gold. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka, to Becky Wakefield for her incredible research, to Light the Way, and to David Nelson.